Hello, everybody, and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Bagelan, and I am in for both Jason and Pascal today. Now, you may be asking, where are Jason and Pascal at the moment? Well, if you've been paying attention, they are actually on their way to New York City for an exciting event tomorrow being held by Sublation Media. So, if you are in the New York area, I just want everyone to remember you can go see them at 3 p.m. in the afternoon at Project Parlor in Brooklyn. There is a link in the description below. And yeah, I would like everybody who can to turn up and show their moral support to the team it's a great opportunity to meet everyone in person. But of course, because they're away, somebody has to somebody has to continue to drive the This Is Revolution ship. And of course, that duty has fallen to me because, of course, Deep State Cuba is also in New York City as well. But one person from the Sublation Media team who was not able to go to New York, just like me, who was had issues with Her Majesty's Passport Office and getting the appropriate paperwork in time done, is going to be here with me today, co-hosting or part of our host triumvirate today. It is the Paul Atreides of the Middle East. It is Stefan Bertram Lee. Hey, Stefan, good to see you.
Hey. Yeah, if you guys don't know, the Muslim ban is still a thing. And I am
The Muslim ban is, I had to Muslim ban it. It was Obama who Muslim banned me. It just meant instead of being able to get an ESTA visa, I have to get I have to go down and, go down and be interviewed by the passport office and the Americans, and they ask you all kinds of questions. Yeah. One of the questions they ask is, have you ever engaged in prostitution? And
yeah, I was genuinely looking forward, not obviously to go to the American embassy would be very annoying, but the actual questioning I think would be very funny.
It is very funny. They ask you all kinds of questions. Well, I'm not only going to be joined here today by Stefan Bertram Lee, but I'm also going to be joined by a very close friend of the TAR family. He is the angry badger of the left. He is the one, the only, the vindicated Vaughn. Hey, vindicated Vaughn, how are you doing?
Way to reference a tweet in the first 30 seconds of a show. Okay.
I had to reference it. How are you doing today, Vaughn? Are you feeling good?
Yeah, I'm feeling okay, I suppose. I mean, we're in as we're going to be talking about today, everything's going to shit all at once. So
everything is going to shit all at once, but it's all Susan Sarandon's fault. People on the Twitter are saying, well, Susan Sarandon doesn't have to worry about getting an abortion because she's rich. It's like, I don't think Susan Sarandon will be needing an abortion these days, but
I mean, people talking about fucking Bernie. It's like, shut the fuck up.
People are talking about all kinds of crazy shit, and I will have some things for us to discuss today about. I think Roe v. Wade is kind of important. It's a touchstone moment, even if it's confirming trends that have already existed. I think this is a very big symbolic and legal break that's taken place, and of course, there's some other things happening in the world, including a quite militant railway strike in the United Kingdom and the rise of Mickey Lynch as a media star, which is actually quite funny. But the main topic for today, which should be an exciting topic, an interesting topic, is the left and the French elections. So, a couple of weeks ago, a lot of people in the West have short attention spans, in the Anglo-Saxon world, should I say, have short attention spans. And we all thought it was over once Macron was reelected as president. We thought the game was done, Mélenchon was out in the first round. Then it was Le Pen and Macron. There was the presidential. Nobody wanted the reformed fascisty one. Instead, they wanted the liberal type one, I guess. The alt-center guy. And then suddenly, because we don't follow politics very well, there's something else happening. So, Stefan, could you introduce our guest today who's going to be talking about the left in France and these parliamentary elections and what the hell is going on?
So I guess today is Rémy, who I met during my master's degree. He had been cruelly and unfortunately tricked into coming to Essex University on the basis that Essex University had, I was going to say, that with a B team. The Essex University had a radical reputation. He got there and didn't find anyone but me, but I'm great, so it's probably worth it in the end. Rémy's been involved in the French left since a very young age. He's very precocious. He's worked in the European Parliament. He's been a big part of. I think he was like he worked in the media for France Awake, and yeah.
Well, Rémy, welcome to TIR. Unfortunately, you will have to spend today with the TIR B team, but we will do our best.
Well, he doesn't know what the A team is. He's lost out on nothing.
He's lost out. He's that's good for us, because at least then he's not disappointed that he's been invited on This Is Revolution, and none of the A team are there. It's like me, Stefan, and Van.
Yeah. Well, hey everyone.
So welcome, Rémy.
Thank you. Hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast show. I don't know what the proper term is.
How many people are watching, Gene?
83 people are watching, which is fine. Sorry to disappoint everybody. They probably just tune in and then realize, there's no Jason and Pascal. And for some reason, the restream went all weird, and now everything is restreaming on my Facebook rather than on the official TIR Facebook. So
I'm not logged in, so I don't have the power. You're the only one with the power.
I'm the only one with the power. Anyway, so Rémy, welcome to This Is Revolution. It is fantastic to have you here. And I would say Essex University. You went to Essex University?
Yes.
I believe Essex politics was regarded as quite radical, at least when I was applying to university, but that was like 20 years ago. So maybe they're dining out on that still.
Well, the website was very, red. Basically, there was all these typos. It looked really progressive. And, I wasn't naive. Obviously, it was a mainstream university. I wasn't waiting for like a big old revolutionary university, but, I thought it was going to be maybe a bit more openly left-wing than obviously the reality, which is most people are just not political. It's just, very...
That's I would agree with that. I think a lot of places that did have radical reputations in the United Kingdom, a lot of those places went by the wayside, especially I think in the 1980s.
There's not like in America where there's like hardcore Catholic universities or whatever. In the UK,
I mean, like when I was at the LSE was, for example, had a reputation. They had some Marxist professors. But, most people when I went there were just like looking for a job in high finance or in human rights law. And when I was in SOAS, there was more overtly, inverted commas, left-wing people, but they were all just looking for jobs in Al Jazeera. Like several people I know either work for Al Jazeera or The Independent, or probably for British intelligence, or probably for both. Who even knows? But that's the way that the university system works in the United Kingdom, and we'll move on from that. So we wanted to talk about with you, Rémy, about the French election. And let me set this up. I think a lot of people in the English-speaking world follow the presidential elections in France, and we're not paying attention to these parliamentary elections, which have been quite surprising, I think would be the word for many people. I think people thought that, people thought that the political game was up for another, couple of years until there was some new elections. But of course we have parliamentary elections. So could you, just to help us understand, what the heck is going on, could you start out by outlining briefly the structure of the presidential and parliamentary system in America, in France, and how these work? Because we're used to, in Britain, a parliamentary system, and in America, a presidential system, but France has a slightly different system, which is neither like the British Westminster model or the American strong executive presidency model. So could you talk a little bit about that structure and help us understand what the hell is going on?
So France is a semi-presidential system. In reality, it's mostly a presidential system. The French president has the most power. It has actually a lot of power, so that's something that some people don't know. The French president is, in terms of institutional power, I think the president in all Europe that has the most power. Actually, now it might I'm sure it actually changed, but like something like 10 years ago, the constitutional rights of the Russian president was actually less than the French president. I don't think it's still the case, but it's a good element of comparison. And the parliament has a very, now it has a very, very small role because it can control the action of the government, and it can name the government, but in practice, the president is actually the one that can choose the governments and present it to the national parliament. And the system is made in a way that every single election since 1958, which is the constitutional system, the Fifth Republic that we have since 1958, is made in a way that the president always has an absolute majority in parliament. So that's kind of the system in which we're in, which leads to a president with a lot of power, with an absolute majority in parliament, which basically leads to an all-powerful executive with a legislative power to basically just support his action and maybe moderate in tiny places. In some occasions in history, though, they have been what we call cohabitation. I don't know if the term in English is the same, which is when
like a split government.
Yeah, so the president is not the same as the governing government. And this is basically what just happened in France right now. But the difference is, usually what happens in France is the president has the majority, but for example, his majority is not strong enough, or his own majority is divided inside his party. And so he decides to, I don't know how to say it in English, basically to break down the parliament, have new elections in the hope of having a stronger majority. And that happened like twice in history, and both times the other party actually won, leading to a different government from the president. What is extremely new today is that in the French election, for the first time since 1958, we have another party winning straight after the election of the president. And that's something completely new. And as you were saying about Mélenchon, obviously in other countries, people thought it was over after the presidential elections, but actually in France too. I mean, everyone in France thought, unfortunately, Macron won, Le Pen lost, this is the end, see you in 5 years. And even us, even inside our party, we were like, we lost.
You're still young, Rémy.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. And then we have to recognize that Mélenchon, pulled the trick from his hat and said, well, you know what? I present myself as prime minister, which is something that, for people to understand, constitutionally isn't a real thing, right? So constitutionally in France, the president chooses the prime minister, and then the prime minister goes to the national parliament and say, okay, will you vote in my favor for me to be prime minister?
So that's technically the same way as the British system with the monarch.
Right. Yeah, in that way, yes. Except that behind that, the prime minister doesn't actually have a lot of power. Yeah. And so when he did that, the first goal actually was not to be prime minister, because we really thought we had no chance at the beginning of the campaign. We had just lost the presidential election, and we said, we want to be prime minister now. But the goal really was to say, okay, we want this parliamentary election to be about beating Macron and not letting him have an absolute majority, not letting him do whatever he wants. And this was new. no one had ever done this in French history. Say, elect me as prime minister by electing a majority of parliamentary from our party. And
before
this,
we move on, could you talk a little bit about the French overseas departments? Because this is something which is very unique to France also. I think people don't really know about it. So if you could talk about that.
So there's a lot to say. So basically, from our colonial history, France has a lot of overseas departments, which are now part of France as normal departments. And they are, they basically suffer from everything we suffer in France times 10. So, the destruction of our public system, the unemployment rates, the police violence, anything that you see in France is multiplied by 10 and is also less scrutinized by the media. So it allows for both companies and the government to actually, function in a way more violent way that they would on the what we call the metropolitan territory. And the result was that in these elections, Mélenchon did, scores in the presidential elections that were completely insane. And we didn't even believe it. During the day, political parties have the first results come back during the day before the media actually announced them, and we couldn't even believe it. In some departments,
because like some of the territories in the Americas, so they're early zones. So the first results came from the overseas territories, and they obviously looked very good for Mélenchon.
Yeah, and way better even than 5 years ago in the presidential election before. We had scores like results like 60%, 70% for Mélenchon in the entire department. There were jokes about, it was Soviet results that we had in these elections. And the weird thing is in the second turn, in the second round of the elections against Macron, the vast majority of these departments voted in favor of Le Pen. But like by far, as in like 60, 50, a tiny bit less than Mélenchon, but still a majority. And, it has to be noted, those are territories where the majority of people are not white. And so the vote for Le Pen was very surprising. There was a lot of discussions around it. And it was really the proof of how much Macron is hated in France. You have people that know that Le Pen is racist, that they're going to, she was threatening to send the military every time there was riots in these territories, because obviously there's a lot of poverty, so there's a lot of riots and protests, and she has an extremely violent discourse towards those territories, and yet they still preferred her towards Macron and his policies and the destruction of public services. So yeah, that's kind of what I can say about the overseas department.
So in the parliamentary elections that have just happened, the left did well, but also this was a united left, where the left stood all their candidates together. But in the presidential elections, this was not the case, and the left was split. There was Mélenchon, but there was also a communist candidate, and there was also a green candidate, right?
Yes. So there was even a socialist candidate, which did a terrible score.
I forgot about them.
So what happened in these elections in terms of union is we've never been, the France Insoumise has never been against union in itself. The principle that we should unite to be stronger, obviously it's a basic idea that we agree with, but the main question was, who do we join, who do we unite with, who do we join with? And there was this idea in part of especially a bit bourgeois part of France that said, oh, all the left should unite because we are the left, as if, that was a magical concept, and everyone who would say I'm from the left was suddenly a good person that would do good policy. So we had the Socialist Party that at the time was, basically headed by Anne Hidalgo, mayor of Paris, who's known for a lot of right-wing policy, for destroying social housing. So a lot of things which obviously we could not agree with. The Green Party, with who we had some points of agreement, but also a lot of things we didn't agree with, as our links to the European Union, how we wanted to disobey some of the treaties in the European Union, to have more ecological and social action, and the Communist Party, which we always, turned, we always wanted to unite with them, as we did in 2017. And basically what happened is the communists refused to join us for a very simple reason, is they didn't think we could win, right? So they started from this idea that Mélenchon was going to lose. And then if you're sure that Mélenchon is going to lose, then the best strategy is not actually to ally with him, but it's to have your own candidate, because the French elections are made in a way that, right, so the president has all the power, and therefore the presidential election is the only moment where people are interested in politics. So if you want to exist politically, you have to have a candidate in the presidential election.
There's also something to do with political funding, right? If you get a certain percentage in the presidential elections, you then get millions from the government for your party.
Yes, so basically, if you do more than 5%, your campaign is like 50% of your campaign is reimbursed, refunded.
Okay.
And if you do more, if you go to the second round, then your whole campaign is, your funds are refunded. And so the communists did they went on the strategy that they said Mélenchon is going to lose, so we have to have this candidate so people know us, and we are going to be part of the restructuration of the left post-election, which was a failure, obviously, because they did not get the 5%, they did not do the score they wished for, and they prevented Mélenchon from accessing to the second round. But what happened is, after the presidential election, the score of Mélenchon was so high, higher than even we expected for a while, that it forced the unity of the left, right? So it was clear as day that the center, not the center ideologically, but the center weight of the left, was Mélenchon, was France Insoumise, and that other parties had a role to play, but which was obviously way minor than France Insoumise. And this is what allowed the union to happen, is to have France Insoumise at the center that said to other parties, well, we're willing to talk with you, we're willing to unite, but we have to base it on our program, because it's our program that made 22%, which was, the same score as Le Pen. And this is how we had a discussion, and this is why it's so historical. The French left has been united before, but never on a radical program, never on the radical side of the left. And this is what we achieved. Unfortunately, we didn't get absolute majority, but we're now in a situation where Macron doesn't have it either, where we're the second political opposition in the country, which is new historically. And now we're going to be talking about it later, but it is a very messy situation in French politics.
And it was 31.5% you got on the popular vote.
Yes, yeah,
It's very strong. But in terms of parliamentary, it's a bit weaker because of the French electoral system, right?
Right. So
round.
We have 140 or 130 parliamentary for the NUP, so the new, how do you translate in English? The new union, the new popular union for ecology and social and ecological, basically, which unites the Socialist Party, the Green Party, France Insoumise, and the Communist Party. So 130 seats. Macron has something like 240 seats. Le Pen's party has something like 90 seats. And the Republican Party, basically the Conservatives, have 70 seats at the moment.
So can I ask, how does your party, the party of Mélenchon, how is that related to the more establishment left-wing parties in France? So we have communists, we have socialists, we have green parties. Those are terms that will be familiar to people, as those kinds of parties exist in different parts of Europe. Where does your party fit into this? And to what extent does your party have connections with, for example, the yellow vest social movements that took place before. How do we understand where Mélenchon and his party fit into the French political spectrum, and what differentiates them from these other more establishment parties of the left?
So historically, to understand France Insoumise, it's important to look at Mélenchon, because France Insoumise has been built around the figure of Mélenchon, which used to be in the Socialist Party. And in 2005, there's the referendum in France on the European Union, on the for a more liberal European Union, and where the majority of French people voted against a more liberal and basically more neoliberal European Union. And the Socialist Party actually stood in favor of this liberal Europe. And at this moment, Mélenchon said, okay, the political line of my parties is too far away from my ideas. And that's when he left the Socialist Party and created a bunch of parties with different names, but let's say basically France Insoumise, to make it easier for people to understand, around a more radical program than the Socialist Party, which could be compared maybe to the, which was not that different from the socialist program from the Socialist Party in France in the 60s or in the 70s, but which obviously in 2010 was seen as very radical. So Mélenchon is a kind of radical socialist in French political landscape, and he united around him people from all kinds of political backgrounds. There were people from the Communist Party, a lot, that joined him. There were other socialists. There were, anti-system people from anti-system movement, from ecological movement, that all joined together to have this this left-wing radical party, which was very anti-system, which was, there was this slogan in 2012, which was translated, basically kick them all away. It was may they all go, basically. All those parties should go away and renew the whole political party system with populist rhetoric, and I'm using these terms in the positive kind of in the positive way. And this is how the party was built, which meant that during the Yellow Vest crisis, we fully supported the Yellow Vest movement. In the first week it was a bit complicated because it was hard to understand what the movement was, what this was all about.
Can we just take a brief digression here?
Yeah.
Can you tell us what the Yellow Vest movement was, just for our friends who were not familiar with this? This term Yellow Vest, it's quite well known in Britain because there's a lot of Yellow Vest kind of copycats in Britain, but I don't think it's so well known in America. So what exactly was this Yellow Vest movement? And just so people are aware what we're talking about.
Right. So I actually wrote now 2 theses on the subject. So I'm starting to look into it a lot. So the Yellow Vests were a movement that started in 2018 when the French government, when Macron decided to raise the taxes on fuel by a lot, like enough for someone to see their 100 or 200 euros more going into fuel if you lived far away from your job every month. Which, the most shocking was not actually the taxes itself, because you could see it as a good gesture, as something, to prevent more pollution, to prevent.
Yeah, it was presented as like a woke progressive move, right?
Right, but actually, when you look at the details, what happened is in 2017, so a year before, when Macron was elected, he suppressed the taxes on the rich, right, in France, which was called ESF, which was when you had more than 1 million in capital, you had a special tax on your capital. That wasn't a lot, but symbolically, obviously the rich hated it because you had to pay just to own capital. And Macron suppressed that tax, and actually that tax on fuel perfectly compensated the loss for the government, by suppressing that tax. So you're reducing taxes on the rich, and then you're increasing taxes on the poor, which is what a fuel tax is, to balance, the budget of the state. So that obviously angered a lot of people. This triggered a very strong reaction in people that were not politicized, for most of them. Those were people that were not militants. A lot of them were actually abstentionists, people that had given up on the political system and that just said, well, we cannot just stand there and accept this. And someone, said, let's put a yellow vest on, and then they all put the yellow vest on, and all across the country, you had actually millions of people. There's estimation between 2 and 3 million people for 70 million population, so it's huge. That blocked the roads in France, that protested, that went to public buildings, that went in front of parliament to demand at first the end of that tax, which actually in 2 weeks was off the table. And what's interesting is you had people that were very lonely, basically. They had very lonely lives. They were suffering from poverty, from a lack of public services. And they went on those roundabouts in France. There's a lot of roundabouts in France. And so this was like the place to gather for the Yellow Vests. And they suddenly realized that they were not the only one suffering from all these problems. And so it started from a very individual mindset, which was, myself cannot pay for the fuel, and turned into, wait, I can't pay, and he can't pay, and none of us can pay. Why? Because we have this problem, and we can't access this. But why is it that all of us have this problem? And so then they were looking for responsibles, for the reasons why this happened. And it was amazing. They collectively developed a political conscience, and a very radical one. You had people that were right-wing, you had people that were very liberal, and all these. You had Macron voters in these people that suddenly, by their own experience and by talking to each other, became, basically left radicals. And the reaction of the government was extremely violent. You had a government that did not accept. Macron has this very authoritarian logic, which is he thought he was elected and that he was gonna change all of France in a Reagan Thatcher way, a very neoliberal mindset, And even his book that he wrote before the 2017 presidential election was called Revolution, which I find funny, but it's actually understandable because if you look at different ideological movements in all across the world, there's actually only 3 that talk about revolution. There's obviously socialist, communist, Marxist movements. There's the fascist movement that talk about revolution, and surprisingly enough, the neoliberals, which if you look at some of the books of Hayek or Friedman, they use the term revolution a lot because they believe that you need a very strong change in the economic system that's actually accompanied by the state in order to push for a neoliberal agenda, to push for a neoliberal economic measures, destroy public services. And so that's what Macron did. And he was so angered by the fact that Yellow Vest stopped his policies that the response was extremely violent. You had people that died. You had a lot of people that lost their hands, that were wounded. That includes me, which I was wounded in the Yellow Vest movement protest, and that's why the Yellow Vest actually ended. That's one of my research in my thesis with a roundabout, a Yellow Vest roundabout. And when I asked them, why did you stop? Why was it? Just because you had enough? Was it because you didn't think it was worth your time? And they all told me, no, it's violence. We're afraid. Is that
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. When you're hit every time you protest, when you see people that are 80 years old being hit by the police, but also economic sanctions. What happened is they forbid Yellow Vest to protest completely. Like you couldn't wear a yellow vest and be anywhere in France on Saturday. it was forbidden, and if you did, you had I think it was 100 euros basically. And then if you did it a second time, it was 300 euros. And then if you did it the third time, it was 1,000 euros. And if you reached that, those 3 cumulative fines, it was 1,000 euros every time you're being fined by the police. So we're talking about people that do not even have 1,000 euros per month. And every time they're stopped by the police, they have to pay 1,000 euros. It was, if you add to that the legislative sanctions, which is that people that basically, just they were being hit by the police, they just pushed back a policeman, and then they find themselves like punished for 6 months of prison. The situation
this
so
is
terrible that people stop.
This is a very important thing, and I want to bring Van in here in a moment, but I think we really need to point a couple of things out here. I think it's important then for us to really comprehend how Macron very much represents a kind of ideal type of centrist neoliberal leader. We see echoes of that in American liberalism, and the authoritarian turn in American liberalism, the desire to put extremely harsh sanctions on people protesting, even if they're protesting things which I personally think are pretty ridiculous. Like they think that there's a tinfoil that Bill Gates is trying to put a chip in them or something like that. People are protesting, and the desire to put extremely draconian punishments on people for all kinds of protesting. It's not to say that the right is any better. They, of course, also have this authoritarian tinge in them, but we do very much see a kind of authoritarian tinge in American liberalism. And I think where that leads is somewhere like France, where you have a leader like Macron who is feted in the Western liberal press as being this great centrist, moderate leader, but who is willing to deploy violence and also, like you say, economic sanctions on people to repress protest. And this comes down to when we're like as Pascal always says, we're dealing with the left and the right flank of capital. We're not dealing with the left and right in absolute terms in many places. So I think that's something that I really wanted to highlight here, is that this kind of repressive activity also takes place in the United States. At times it's deployed against the left, and at times it's deployed against people on the political right. We've seen this in Canada. Again, maybe you agree with, maybe you don't agree with the trucker protests, but some of the sanctions being put on people who attend those protests are somewhat over the top. So I want to bring Van in now, because you haven't spoken much, which is a great loss to us all. So Van, do you want to pop in with the next question or comment?
The yellow vest discourse in the States was dominated by a weird question, which was whether or not it was somehow secretly left wing or secretly right wing. I would say, in general, it seems like the left in France has benefited from that movement. But can you talk about the kind of mixed character of all who were involved in that? Because I think how radicalizing it was and how many different parts of French society were involved got underplayed or even misused in American attempts to narrativize the Yellow Vest movement in French politics.
So what I was saying beforehand was that it was all kind of people, from the French society that participated in the Yellow Vests, and people that voted for literally any candidate. You had people from France Insoumise, obviously. You had people from the more radical left. You had abstentionists. You even had a lot of people actually that voted for Macron, because he still had something like 20-30% of the votes, 20% of the votes in 2017. You had a lot of people that voted for Marine Le Pen, and the reason why it worked in the beginning is it was not political. The only thing that united the Yellow Vest was wearing a yellow vest and demanding the end of the tax on fuel. The impact of that is that people stop talking about politics, even though it was an extremely political, event. People stopped talking about politics. They stopped talking about who they voted for, and they only started talking about what do we need for our situation to get better. What do we need, for our purchasing power to go up, and this led the poorest people of France, which was the people that participated in the Yellow Vest, to basically unite. And what we're seeing in France is, so for people that don't know, Marine Le Pen has very high votes in the poorest part of France, a bit less than Mélenchon, but still a very high part. If you take Marine Le Pen and Mélenchon, you have the vote of 80-90% of the poor people in France. And the Yellow Vest movement was an occasion to get rid of any of the, how can I say it in a proper way, any debate that is non-related to basically the economic side of politics was not in debate during the Yellow Vest. And you did not have the issue of all what we call progressive policies were not in question. The only questions were, will I get a higher wage? Will I get lower taxes? Will we have better public services? And so that allowed a lot of Le Pen voters to stand side by side with, for example, Mélenchon voters, because they were fighting for the same thing at that moment. And I think on the long term, that had a positive effect, because it brought back a lot of Marine Le Pen voters, which realized that in the end, the most important thing is still, do I have enough money at the end of the month to survive? And it put the focus on this, and it brought a lot of voters back to the left, or at least to abstaining during elections.
To switch tacts, to kind of just to get a basis of kind of the situation with Macron and Mélenchon and kind of France's attitude and position to recent events. Both Macron and Mélenchon have faced criticism for their attitudes, policies towards the Ukrainian war. What is Mélenchon's perspective on this? What is the perspective of his party? I have the awareness that foreign policy is one of the major breaks within NUPES between France Awake and the Greens and the Communists.
Yeah.
And what do you think France's participation in this war will be now that the situation is going to be led by Macron?
So it's, first of all, obviously extremely hard to respond to this question, because there's no perfect solutions for France in this conflict. So our initial position was to say that obviously we support Ukraine against the Russian invasion, and the question was, how do we support at best Ukraine without entering, without being belligerents, without becoming part of that war. And the position of Mélenchon was saying this, we have to do everything in order not to go, not to enter war with Russia, because we have absolutely no interest in this. France is a nuclear power, so we have, I believe, we have a higher responsibility maybe than other countries in Europe to guarantee that we don't fall into nuclear war. And so this is why France walks on a thread on this question that is, extremely thin. France Insoumise at the moment is against sending weapons to Ukraine. We were in favor of, basically for now, and we'll see how the position changes, but for now our line is to say we want to sanction the Russian government and the Russian support at best. And instead of sanctioning population, we want to sanction, Russian billionaires. So seize all assets from Russian billionaires and from, sorry, I'm a bit sick, and from the Russian government and all allies of the Russian government.
And I saw that French purchase of Russian crude oil has gone up since February 24th.
Sorry, can you say that again?
French purchase of Russian crude oil has increased since the start
Really?
of the war. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's money to be made, Rémy.
yeah, I'm not surprised. And the whole difficulty is, France Insoumise has always said that we are not aligned. We want France not to be aligned. Obviously not to Russia, and that's that's very clear, but not to the US and NATO either. And right now we're in this situation where we're presented with a situation where we can either basically choose to buy Russian oil or American oil or Middle Eastern oil, and those are situations where there's no good answers, right? So you're in either cases you're buying from a power where I mean, I'm going to be honest, it's hard to respond to these questions because I'm
very glad that I'm not answering, because trying to form a question of not what the situation is in Ukraine, but what should be done is I'm like,
all right. So maybe if you have a clearer question that I could answer that is more, on the current line more than what has to be done.
I do have a question. It's like a two-parter. Could you outline a little bit specifically what the program is of this new alliance? You mentioned at the beginning, Mélenchon put himself forward as a PM. What is the program that you want to drive through, both at home or primarily at home? You've mentioned a bit about international, but as we know, that's a very difficult question because you come up against the career bureaucracy, the foreign policy establishment, and also the fact that it is very difficult to chart out an independent path, for example, on energy. You can complain about American oil, you can complain about Saudi oil, you can complain about Russian oil. And let's just also say France is not some innocent sort of third world imperialized country. That France itself also has a brutal history of imperial adventures as well. But I think the domestic program is important for us to understand. What are the things that you guys are putting forward? And the second part is and I realize here I'm asking you as an individual, not as a member of a party, but at least in the short term, do you feel you're going to be able to execute on this, or are you still in the process of building power? And how do you build power? Because we've seen, both in the case of Sanders and of Corbyn in Britain, that this kind of left populism has collapsed. Does France have any different conditions that makes this project more viable than it has been in the Anglo-Saxon world?
All right, so I'm going to try to answer each question one by one. So for the program, sorry, I'm going to drink a bit of water. Our main policies, the program is constructed in different ways. The first one is responding to the urgency of poverty right now in France, and the increasing poverty and unstable job situation that we have. So we want to raise the minimum wage from which is today 1,300 euros basically to 1,500 euros. So that's 200 euros increase. We want to put in place what would be called in English minimum. Basically, that nobody be paid less than the poverty line, and not even paid. Nobody would be under the poverty line. So 60% of the median income, which in France is 1,063 euros, so basically 1,000 euros, which would mean that anyone in France would have at least 1,000 euros in any situation. That would mean that for the youth between 18 and 25, actually from 16 if you are already working till 25, you would have 1,063 euros, to do your studies, to finance your life, your housing, everything. For unemployed people, that would mean that the minimum unemployment benefits at all time would be 1,063 euros. And it would also mean that the minimum, sorry, I'm losing my words. The minimum retirement benefits would be 1,063 euros, and so nobody in France would be under that line. Basically, this is our main urgency policy. It's the minimum we can do in order to prevent anyone falling into something you cannot get out from, which is becoming homeless and losing all losing everything. From that point onwards, we have massive investments. Well, the logic is basically to having an ecological and social transition. This is the core of the program. Is saying, okay, right now in France we have two problems. We have the climate change and massive pollution that we have to change, and the terrible state of our public service, which is probably better than a lot of countries, but compared to what France had 20 years ago is absolutely terrible. And so we want to invest 250 billion euros, obviously a lot, to create public services, create public jobs. I think it's, and in 5 years, it's something like 600,000 jobs, to build renewable energy, to build public services, to build trains, to replace, to reindustrialize the country. We want to make the factories come back to France, and be self-reliant, and produce all the goods we need inside France. Have, in terms of agriculture, we want this ecological transition to apply to agriculture by going back to I don't know how you say in English. We call it in France basically a farmer's agricultural policy, meaning that you deindustrialize. I mean, you use less machine, more technique, less polluting technique, which require more farmers, but at the end pollute less and gives a better and a better quality of food. If this is clear. I don't know if I'm missing any other point from the program.
But no, that sounds covering the important things.
What was the questions again?
Well, the other question was like, how likely do you think you are to succeed in this program in the short term, and how are you going to overcome the obstacles that brought the Sanders movement and the Corbyn movement, which I think we could broadly say are comparable, brought those to an ignominious end? Are there any factors in France that will make it more likely that this kind of left populist challenge will be more successful?
So to answer, we have to go back to the very complex discussion around how the French Parliament is looking today. And when I mean it's complex is, to be very, very honest, the vast majority of French today do not understand what's happening. And I don't mean it in a bad way or anything. It's just France has never had this situation before, and nobody understands a thing about what happens. So we have, the left-wing alliance that has basically 1/5, a bit more like 1/4 of the parliament, 150 seats. You have Macron's party, which has less than 50%, something like 40% of parliament, and then the rest is being split between. So maybe you have another 1/4 that is being split between the conservative and the far right. Now the situation is, Macron cannot name a new government, because if he goes in front of Parliament and asks for, the Parliament has to confirm the new government, and the majority of the Parliament is against Macron. Because if you add the votes of the National Front, of the Conservatives, and of the Left-Wing Alliance, there is an absolute majority against Macron. And all of these parties have said that they would oppose Macron. right? So there's not these, which something that could be expected is the conservative aligning with Macron to govern, right? But the conservative are in such a weak state in France that if they ally with Macron, it's the end of the party, right? Macron would basically eat them up, absorb all of its members, like it has already done actually a lot. And so the Conservative Party has absolutely no chance. Not no chance, but has for now stated that it would not ally with Macron. The far right obviously said it would not ally with Macron, and obviously the left-wing alliance has said it would not ally with Macron. So the situation is extremely unclear, and the question is, can Macron actually govern? Right? We're in the situation that countries like Belgium have experienced, where there's no government. I mean, for now there's a government in France, but we could end up in a situation where there's no government. If Macron doesn't make any alliance, he will have to govern basically alone, and every proposal that he would put forward to the national parliament will not be voted. So the question is Macron willing to basically spend 5 years doing nothing, which is an option, right? He could just say, well, I will form, I will keep the actual government, because as long as the current government stays, the national parliament cannot overthrow it, except if it gets a majority of parliament together. But that would mean, I don't know if people are still following, because it gets complicated. But if
so the situation is like, it's not like the British system where a majority can just vote the government out. They need to form within themselves a new government, and obviously because the far right and the far left can't form a government together, they can't form an alternative, so they can't get rid of the present government.
No, so they don't have to form a government together, except France doesn't have the parliamentary culture that British has, right? And so because of the presidential system, parties never have to vote together, right? There's not this culture of doing concessions and negotiating in order to pass laws, because the president always has majority. So why would you vote with other parties if you don't need to? And so what happens is the far right would never vote with France Insoumise. France Insoumise would never vote with the far right, which would never vote with the conservatives, because their elector would say, well, you're aligning with them, even though it's just a vote. The idea of co-signing a text together would be seen as treason.
Even if it's just a dissolution bill?
I mean, I think it would be a good idea, because just voting out Macron would not mean aligning with any of the conservatives or the far right. But what would be sure is that basically, so one of the group has to put the text forward, and then the other party
so who gets to start?
Right.
Got it.
The conservative will say, well, we'll vote them out. Yeah, the conservative will say, well, we'll vote them out, and we're going to say, yeah, but like, how about you vote our resolution? And then the far right will say, no, like, we agree, but then you have to sign our resolution. So it's not that, like, the probability that the government is voted out is actually not that strong. But at the same time, Macron cannot keep the current government, because the current government does not represent the political balance of France, but he cannot change it either. So for now, the only solution he has is keeping the current government, but not being allowed, like not being able to pass any laws in parliament.
So Macron can't dissolve parliament and form new elections, or can he?
He can. So that's the other option. So either he tries to pass laws, but there's a good chance that none will pass, except some economic policies that the conservative will vote with him, or he can, dissolve parliament. But the problem with that is, he'll most probably
lose harder.
Yeah, he could lose hard. I mean,
yeah,
so
it's
it's
more.
It's a big
like it happened in France history before. We've had presidents that had a relative majority because some of people in the party left during the term, and then had new elections and lost more. So the best option for Macron is aligning with the Conservative Party, or even passing laws in parliament without changing government. But for now, they'll need the votes of the far right. And actually, if you allow me 5 minutes to read, I have a little list of what the French government has said about the far right since the new elections, and it's quite terrible. It's quite terrible because the party that presented itself as the opposition to fascism, the one party that we should vote for in order to prevent Marine Le Pen from accessing its power, now understands that they need this party to govern. Because one thing, I'm sorry, it's another bit of detail, but that's very important to understand, is there's a thing in the French parliament which is called the Finance Commission.
Mm.
And this commission has to be from opposition. Right? So it cannot be Macron's party. And so it has to be from an opposition party. And this Finance Commission has access to all the tax declaration of company and of citizens in France. Right? And the role of this commission is to guarantee that the budget of the country is balanced, or is in good term, good health.
It is what it say it is.
Right, and it's to prevent any party that governs alone basically to sink France and go crazy with the budget. But the problem is, if the left wing, as we should, we're the major opposition, so we have access to this finance commission. We could, we're not saying we will, but we could have access to all the tax evasion, to all the companies not paying their taxes in France.
Woohoo.
And obviously that scares.
It causes a lot of problems generally, right?
Yeah, so that scares a lot the right and Macron. And even though we would not be in power, we would have the power to put on, in the medias and in the public debate, extremely, unappreciable things for the government. And so the government is trying to seduce the far right, and actually even trying for the far right to get this finance commission, because it would be better for the government for the far right to be the stronger opposition. And so we've had, since the elections, for example, the Minister of Justice of France, Éric Dupond-Moretti, which said, let's move forward with the National Front and Parliament and work together. That's one of the quotes. It's very vague, right? But you get the idea.
Well, this is not too dissimilar from the contradictions that exist in American politics, because we're told constantly you have to vote Democrat as the opponents, in order to oppose the fascistic Republican Party. Yet at the same time, there is a fetishization of, we have to be bipartisan and cooperate with one another. So there is a massive dissidence between this, and I guess in France, perhaps you're not used to this to the same degree because of this lack of a parliamentary culture. But now because they have to negotiate, they can't just play the old vote for us and we can ignore these guys, because of course Macron doesn't want to have to govern with the Le Pen's group. He doesn't want to have to do that. Naturally, he wants to govern for his own party. Yeah. But he would much rather deal with them than handing all over the paperwork of, where your taxes are going and who is doing all this thing to a potentially unreliable force. I think it comes down to the classic orientation of capital is to who is going to, even if we could say, this left alliance is a reformist alliance, it's not radical, it's not truly revolutionary or whatever, there is no doubt that capital will not trust those people with access to the financial data of a country which is already highly financialized and is run by a banker and has a quite authoritarian liberal authoritarian, but a liberal authoritarian elan in terms of, Macron's wife was telling people they couldn't play video games. She should be the expert on, things that will disturb teenagers. So,
you had to get one of those in, didn't you?
I had to get one of those in. But you gotta get it. But it's true. I mean, she is the expert. What will lead to a maladjusted? Because Macron looks like an American Psycho guy. Well, we are coming to the end of our time with Rémy today, but I just wanted to open it to Vaughn and to Stefan for any last questions you might have before we go to our comments.
I have a question, but it's really long. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question, I think, anyway, even though it's probably not, we don't have the time to answer it. But so, Rémy, France has always had this kind of ambiguous relationship to NATO. But obviously, with its right-wing government, it was obviously de Gaulle, which withdrew France from the NATO military, whatever the fuck it is. Didn't fully withdraw from NATO. I looked it up today. I thought he'd left, but that's not what happened. So France has tried to chart constantly to have an independent foreign policy, but obviously, as a normal bourgeois state led by right-wing parties, that independent foreign policy is imperialism. Imperialism predominantly, primarily, whatever, in West Africa, but also elsewhere. And Mélenchon is also someone that wants to pursue an independent French foreign policy, but obviously, for him, it's very, very important to reorientate towards West Africa and elsewhere. I think he opened his campaign not in France, but in Africa. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you, like, how do you think, if Mélenchon won the next party, or the parliament went to him, went to the party, went to your organization, how could France chart an independent foreign policy which is not at the same time imperialist?
Yes, so that's that's a very good question and complicated question as well, because so first of all, obviously we would leave NATO, which is what we always wanted. It's going to be a bit more difficult than before because there was a very strong anti-NATO sentiment in the French population, which obviously is a bit stronger now. I mean, pro-NATO now than before for obvious reasons. So we'll see how if it's possible even to leave NATO. If the majority of your population is against it, you have to use arguments and use time to persuade the majority of the population that it's a good thing. And once we do this, France has, once you're independent, you have to choose how you behave, on the international scene. And France has three major regional links. Actually, let's say four. We have obviously the Atlantic, which is part of France. Half of our border is the Atlantic Ocean, which I think it's part of the world we were linked to enough. We have Europe. We have Europe, which is obviously, I think we're integrated enough in Europe. And then we have two other international scenes. We have the Mediterranean, which is, we're one of the major countries, and actually the first economic power of the Mediterranean. And so France Insoumise really has this objective of having a Mediterranean union and having making the Mediterranean an economic power, and that benefits everyone in the Mediterranean Union, especially obviously the poor country today, that do not benefit from the all the wealth that the Mediterranean could be producing. So that's more on the economic side, and then on the cultural side, we have, unfortunately, due to the colonial past of France, very strong links to a lot of African countries, especially in some parts of East Africa and North Africa in general. And so the idea is to say that today these countries do share a culture with France. It's linked to colonization, but now they speak French. They share cultural links, and the question is, okay, now how can we use this bond to make the most out of, make the most for everyone? France is projected to be in 2050 the most spoken language, second most spoken language, I think, in the world, behind Chinese. And so what we want to do is build, a cultural alliance altogether, which is for art, cinema, music, which would be mostly financed by France, because obviously it's the country that has the most money. and that would allow, but you know, in a horizontal union, that would allow to develop culture from African nations, from French-speaking nations, including Quebec and Canada, and have this very powerful cultural union that speak French. We would, you know, have we want to develop a French-speaking space university. Basically, the idea is that we want to build, you know, knowledge around space, which is something that France has a lot of advance in, and share it with all of African nations that speak French, having all those, you know, cultural alliance with them. So it's a pretty big project, but basically building an economic alliance in the Mediterranean Union and a cultural alliance with all French-speaking countries by trying not to be neocolonial, you know, and that's the hardest part, is how do you build that without France, you know, controlling that alliance. And,
yeah, no, I think it's obviously something which, yeah, people will have problems with it, and it's kind of, yeah, it's very difficult to achieve. But I think it's very important that kind of the French left actually has kind of like a serious program of what it would do internationally, which is distinct from the right and also like significant, which I think is really lacking basically everywhere else. Jean, you're muted.
I think you're totally correct there, Stefan. Beyond stating what we don't want, the Anglo-Saxon left in both Britain and the United States, and I mean here the reformist left too, you know, does not have a concrete program of what it wants to achieve internationally. I mean, if you're like a Leninist or a Trotskyist or a revolutionary, you know, your answer is quite simple. You want international proletarian revolution. But if you're posturing as a reformist, as, you know, someone who wants to see a Sanders presidency or a Corbyn type person as prime minister, well, then a lot of their work time is going to be spent in international affairs. And whereas the reformist left in the United States and Britain does have a program, you know, like better social services, healthcare, it has not articulated any serious kind of foreign policy, and doesn't seem to have any conceptual framework in the way that it will develop foreign policy. Now, whether you're a revolutionary or a reformist, you know, that's, you know, I'm not making a critique on that. I'm saying that if you do believe in a social democratic reform program and you do believe in taking power through parliamentary means, a big proportion of what you're going to be doing is dealing with foreign policy. And I do not see a serious conversation taking place on the Anglo-Saxon left about how to unwind empire, how to, you know, beyond saying like, you know, America bad, end imperialism. Those are like slogans, but they have to be actualized and concretized, right? You know, how do you unwind empire? And I don't think
had like big plans about, you know, allying with the left in Latin America, but the situation there, that's not based on Britain in any way, right?
No,
Britain
no.
doesn't have like this history with Latin America.
Well, it does have a history with Latin America.
Well, you know, obviously, Britain has a history with everywhere.
With everywhere.
Every single country on the planet, but everything, you know, there's different levels. And that was just something that, you know, was because Corbyn has like a Latin American wife, or because the left was happening to be winning in there. But obviously, by the time he came to power, it could have completely reversed and gone the other way. But
exactly.
The proposals from the French left actually have something to do with the history of France, the position of France, the position of French capital, and hopefully, you know, the kind of internationalist perspective on things.
And I think it's really important that, you know, when there's like, obviously if we do that, you know, if you build, you know, groups and unions around cultural elements that origin from, you know, colonialism, you will have the criticism, right, that it's a form of neocolonialism. It's obviously people are going to criticize that, but the question is, what's the alternative, right? Because those countries have adopted language. You know, there's very little countries that have, you know, that went away from the language from the colonial powers, and so they are already, you know, under influence from that power. If you look at Latin America, there is obviously a strong influence from the Spanish cultural production. You know, everything that happening in Spain has an influence on Latin America. Everything happening in the US and the UK has an influence on the English-speaking world. And in the same way, France today has a huge impact on African countries, even without being united to them, right? Just the fact that we speak the same language, and that's the thing that Mélenchon has had a lot of, you know, a lot of thoughts around it, which is, you know, whether we like it or not, we are linked to these countries, because when Mélenchon does a speech, he is listened to and then the entire of Africa. We're actually always surprised when people from our party go to Africa. People saying, no, but we listen to what you say, and you actually, you know, you're part of the discussion in African politics, because we can understand, and because we can understand, you influence us. And so I think from the moment you start accepting that you already have influence, the question is, how do we want that influence to play out? And I think that kind of, you know, takes away some of the guilt, and I put in quote, that some people from the left can have, where you think, oh no, as soon as we work together with African countries or with old colonial powers, we're basically doing neocolonialism. The truth is, whatever we are doing neocolonialism, like cultural neocolonialism, by influencing those countries with our language and with everything that's happening in the country. So might as well do it in, you know, in the less neocolonial way possible.
You imagine some kind of like left that hates itself coming to power in France and like banning Africa from speaking French.
You build a space but you build the space university in Burkina Faso to be. But I think
they should build the space university in the part of Latin America that France owns, well, South America. Well, that's where they put the rockets, because it's on the line where it's closer to the space.
So is Burkina Faso, but I
don't think so, actually, because they always do them in South America for some reason.
There's actually projects for both of those of what you're talking about.
Okay.
So the one thing I would say, and I appreciate what you're talking about, Rémy, is like I have on this show hinted about my ambivalence about decolonization. And what I mean by my ambivalence about decolonization is that decolonization ultimately was a historical defeat for socialists. Of course, it was necessary, but what happened in decolonization was not a radical transformation, but rather the proliferation of the capitalist nation-state model to different parts of the world. There hasn't really been an attempt by the socialist left in Europe to go beyond, to inverted commas, sublate the colonial system, but rather merely to replicate the system of nation states that exist in different parts of the world. And whether or not, I don't know too much about the proposals here, but I think it is important to try and move beyond a kind of very limited nation-state form of nationalism, and to try and think of alternative international relationships that could exist. At the end of the day, that's what the Bolsheviks attempted to do in Russia after 1917. It wasn't to decolonize the Russian Empire, as happened, inverted commas, in 1991, where you see the proliferation of nation states, but the creation of a new political formation that is superior to the old imperial order. And so I think this is something that we really, you see, I use sublate all the time now. I sublate everything. But one thing I want to thank you, Rémy, for joining us today. And I thought it was a really fruitful discussion. And I think we definitely have to have you back on again in the future to talk more about perhaps foreign policy.
When we've got the Haitian on, and it can be much more fractious.
Yeah, we can get the Haitian on, who will definitely push back on the French community of culture thing, unless you're going to put a Dessalines statue up on the Eiffel Tower and guillotine, all the people he doesn't like. But Rémy, thank you so much for joining us, and
thank you for inviting me.
We hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
I hope to. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, guys. Well, that was a fantastic discussion. Fun.
People have been arguing in the comments about Rémy saying that the francophone is going to become like first, second, or third language. But the point is that people are missing is that the population of West Africa and Central Africa is expected to explode, and that's why they're not saying that it has a lot now. But the point is that the population of Niger, for instance, is expected to treble in the next 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I might put a damper on those population expectations.
Yeah, I know, because they're just projections of current trends. Like,
but nevertheless, there's a significant block of the world that is French speaking. France is a
unfortunately.
Pourquoi France français est une langue très belle, mon ami.
Well, I'm deciding to speak up now that the Frenchman's left.
No, it was. Go ahead. Any thoughts and comments?
No, I was just surrounded by the French and the English, the two people in the world that I would probably wipe out. So
Vaughn's going fucking. What do you call that guy? Has.
He's going full infra has, right? Do you know where a woman pees from?
No. I think what's interesting actually though is I don't know. For example, if the U.S. was to say adopt an a unwinding of its colonial holdings process, one thing we haven't done is insist on English. And while English is the lingua franca, of business. So much so that, I mean, I have stories about like when I was in China and someone couldn't speak Mandarin or English, they got chastised because it's like, well, if you don't speak Mandarin, you should at least speak English.
Yeah.
And I had to step in and speak some Korean. But it's interesting to think about because I don't think that policy that would be available to the French actually would not be available to the U.S. left in the same way. We aren't the colonial holders of Canada, the UK, Australia, etc. Like, and you know, if anything, we still have a little bit too much influence by the British, as noted by your presence here. But
yeah, I mean, obviously, there's been constant attempts to reorientate Britain towards the Anglophone world, but what is meant there is the dominions, the white colonies of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
But also the United States. I think the fantasy of the political right, at least I think elements of the political right who backed Brexit, was that we could move from the European Union towards an Anglosphere, which
so you could become Airstrip 1. Yay.
Yeah,
have you seen that US Congress people keep threatening Britain and our government over fucking Ireland?
Yeah, well, you know, it would all be fine if we just all became states, right? You could have Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, England, and Scotland as new states, and the conservatives would like it in America because they love England and they like Downton Abbey, and the Democrats would probably end up getting all the senators from those places except maybe Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, you say that, but like, it's also that thing. I mean, we're going to talk about the US soon. But the thing that constantly happens is people are like, oh, it would be great for Texas to secede, and then because the Democrats would win every election. But people were just saying that about demographics like 10 years ago, that the Republicans couldn't possibly win an election. So I'm sure like every state south of the Mason-Dixie line left, the Democrats would find some way to only win half the elections anyway.
Oh, probably because they're so goddamn terrible. But before we get on to America, I do want to discuss Britain. And I specifically want to, talk a little bit about the industrial action taking place on the railways at the moment. And this is quite important because, the railways in Britain the unions are extremely powerful. And my pet theory is the reason that they're so powerful is that they can make rich people's lives uncomfortable, because whether you're rich or poor, if you live in London, you need to rely on the tube unless you're so rich.
That statement is obviously completely incomprehensible to Americans.
What do you
Unless
mean?
they're from New York, actually.
Yeah, I'm saying that rich Americans don't go on the fucking train, do they?
No, but
No.
like but if you live in London, even if you're rich and driving a car, if the tube was on strike, the whole place is shut down. So unless you're so rich, you have a chopper.
One of the best ways to tell about kind of the average demographics of the tube is the adverts they have on there. Mm-hmm. And the adverts are all for fucking business investment and shit.
That's true. Rich people do, middle class and rich people do ride the tube. It's like quite pleasant and things like that. So the railways have gone on strike in Britain. And this is really part of this wave of industrial action we're seeing. Now, Vaughan has been pointing this out, that there's being a push to sort of greater unionization in America, but it still isn't really getting back to the pre-pandemic levels. And Striketober, I think, Vaughan, your point has been that, yeah, in the short term, it seems like a spike, but taken within long-term trends, it is not so much of a spike, right? Is that correct?
It's absolutely not a spike. In fact, what you saw in Striketober was just a slightly less than normal pre-2020 strike month and strike year. And it was kind of picked arbitrarily because Social Democrats like to notice things 5 or 6 months late. There was actually a significant strike uptick in the beginning of 2021 up through the summer. But again, it was just going back to pre-pandemic norms. And then Striketober happened, and it was actually lower than pre-pandemic norms. So it was lower than 2019. This is because it was declared, lately by people who didn't really know what was going on. We have seen a fairly massive unionization drive in retail and in some degree in logistics, mostly at the Amazon plants. But we haven't, and I'm going to get a lot of pushback for this because it's going to make it sound like I'm accusing Starbucks employees of being elites, which I'm absolutely not. But what we haven't seen is like massive franchise unionization or unionization in things that are not attached to higher end progressive neighborhoods, which Starbucks almost inadvertently is. And so while there's a lot of good news on the unionization front in the United States, it's being oversold by people often as this proof of a giant union, explosion. And that's not the case. And a lot of states, by the way, in the United States crushed public sector strikes during COVID. They just crushed them outright. There was a case in Maine in 2001 where they basically said that under the circumstances of COVID, that our railway people couldn't strike in that state, which effectively also spiraled out and depressed striking in states that wasn't under that jurisdiction. And so one of the reasons why you don't see the kinds of labor actions that you see in a place like London or France is because we are so highly federated and so regionally organized in our power bases that unless it's the New York subway, even the DC subway could probably shut down. And DC is one of the cities where I have seen well-off people actually use the train. But that's it. But even that would not shut, probably wouldn't have the kind of regional import as the tube shutting down. It's just nothing compares to that in the United States. There's not a logistic choke point that could do that in the same way.
Now, in Britain, I think what we've seen, and I'm going to show everybody a clip here. We've seen this, we've seen the right-wing press pull out all the stops to demonize the railway workers. And they really have. I mean, I was looking at the headlines today. It's all the classics like Back to the 70s, Winter of Discontent, all these
it's June 25th.
Yeah, I know, it's insane. But
we saw the solstice 4 days ago.
I know the union leader who I have up here, Mickey Lynch, has proved remarkably deft at dealing with the media. So just for those of you who haven't seen, I just wanted to, give you all like a little bit of his video to see what's been going on and to see how he's been dealing with it.
Doing full-time jobs, who are having to take state benefits and use food banks. That is a national grace.
What will they do if agency workers try to cross those picket lines?
Well, we will picket them. What do you think we'll do? We run a picket line and we'll ask them not to go to work. Direct lie.
If you are a Marxist, then you're into revolution and into bringing down capitalism. So are you or aren't you?
Richard, you do come up with the most remarkable twaddle sometimes.
The unions don't tell me who I am and whether or not I'm working class or whatever, any of those sorts of things.
You weren't working class. I don't even know your name.
That's a lie. You can see what picketing involves. I can't believe this line of questioning. Picketing is standing outside the workplace to try and encourage people who want to go to work not to go to work. What else do you think it involves? You've also lied that we left negotiations on Saturday and went to a rally. There were no negotiations scheduled for Saturday. You are a liar. The pensions of our members are going to be decimated. They're going to make us poorer not only while we're at work, but poorer in retirement. And that's an agenda that the government has got because they want to subsidise the private sector in this country, as they are doing in the health service, which is being consumed by the private sector, as they've done in the education service, which is being consumed by the private sector.
He should be apologising to the doctors and nurses who can't get to hospital, the patients who can't get their operation, the kids who will miss out on their education today, but also those armed forces veterans who risk their lives for our freedoms, who won't be able to celebrate Armed Forces Day on Saturday.
Do you want to apologise for all that, Mick?
Well, I think Jonathan should apologise for talking nonsense. None of that is true.
And you're a liar. What the rest of the country suffers from is the lack of power, the lack of the ability to organise, and the lack of the wherewithal to take on these employers that are continually driving down wages and making the working class in this country poorer year on year on year, while the rich get richer.
I welcome anyone that wants to join us on our picket lines and show us messages of support.
All right, well,
if Keir Starmer can't do that, that's a problem for him, not for us. I don't want people to be inconvenienced, and I want a settlement to this dispute. I can't do that with a backbench MP who's just learned it off a script. And one of the reasons we're not affiliated is because Labour politicians since Blair have not identified with working class people. And failing to do that is one of the problems they've got in working class communities, and they've left the door open to populists and others to come into the situation. The Labour Party is about supporting working people, or it should be, not triangulating from opinion makers such as the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and the Times. So they've got to sort out their identity, and they've got to come up with a set of policies.
There are lower paid people and there are wealthy people in this society. And what's wrong in this society is that there is an imbalance between the people that do the work to keep this country going, who create the wealth of our civilisation and don't get a fair share of that wealth because it's going to people who are vastly wealthy. Labour should be comfortable with backing working class people who are struggling, and one of the ways that they can redress the imbalance is through industrial action where negotiations fail. What else are we to do? Are we to plead? Are we to beg? We want to bargain for our futures. We want to negotiate. And if we're not bargaining, you have to beg. And I don't want any working class people in this country to have to beg the employers for a decent living. And Keir Starmer shouldn't want that either.
Okay, so so that's Mickey Lynch, who's seems to have come out quite well from this labor dispute, becoming quite, I would say, despite the attacks on him in the public, he's become quite popular. I think people, even people who perhaps oppose him, have been quite interested in the way that he communicates. And there's been a lot of talk about, well, he's a good communicator. People should follow his style of communication, which I think misses two fundamental points. Is I think he, as much as the spin doctors sort of want to try and find a formula for communicating, the fact that he's communicating a very elemental truth to working people in Britain makes him powerful. And two, the fact that he has a giant fuck off union behind him, which gives him the platform to come to the media and talk the way that he is. That's it's not just a matter of his presentation, which is also quite good because the people he's coming up against just look like bloody morons.
I mean, a friend of mine had a viral tweet, which I think is very similar to what you're saying, that we can't just become Mickey Lynch. He's like that because he spent 20, 30 years convincing people in his trade union. And that's why he can talk to working class people, talk to all British people, because that's what he's just done for his whole life. He's convinced working people successfully of various things, and that's how he's got to be in the position he is.
I totally agree. I think he resonates with people because, again, we're in an era where we don't seem to have any inverted commas authentic politics, and he's just cutting through the bullshit. But it's not an act; it's just the nature of his political education. Whether you agree with his political agenda or not, he can talk very forcefully on a subject in a way that really disarms these so-called right-wing populists. Because when you see these right-wing populist Joe people come up against him, he just decimates them, right? Because it's not a cosplay for him. He is a union official who is brought up within the workers' movement. And what I really wonder is, are we moving away now from the left populist era towards an era where the focus is going to be, and perhaps should be, on labor militancy and trade union consciousness? Was the left populist, do we need more Mickey Lynches and more labor militancy, or do we need another Sanders run, or do we need another Corbyn?
Well, I don't know. I don't know to be the boring centrist, but I'm sure that Mickey Lynch and Jeremy Corbyn are they probably know each other quite well, and they're probably a lot more acquainted than we are with either of them. I don't know. It's kind of this thing of it'd be nice. Obviously, yeah, kind of because Sanders and Corbyn come out of having a weak institutional left, which then still has a popular basis among people when people become aware of it, and so become relatively successful, but then run to some kind of limit. And the thing with obviously it'd be great if there were more Mickey Lynches, which were then in a position to kind of control politics in Britain or in the United States. But that only happens at the point where the institutional left is very powerful already. So I don't know. I guess I'm being a normal determinist, as I always am.
What do you think, Vaughn? Is it a chicken or egg, or are we barking on the wrong tree? Do we need a pivot towards organizing labor? I mean, I realize sort of the typical Leninist view.
The average leftist to fucking organize labor in the United States is the question, and the answer is, of course, not. They can't talk to most people. If it would be great if we had more Mickey Lynches, I suppose. There are structural reasons why that would be much harder to do in the U.S. than the United States. Chris Smalls has come to represent a kind of a new face of labor in the U.S., and probably one that speaks to a lot of people's actual, who they would meet on the job. Mickey Lynch looks like a very well-dressed blue collar chap, and to my grizzled American eyes, I don't know what his class markers are, but they don't seem particularly posh to me. But what the fuck would I know? So I mean, it would be good. The thing is, in the United States, the populism has been sold as a way to get your Mickey Lynches, not the other way around. So the people see them as totally intertwined. And there is some sense in which the leadership of, say, Amazonians United or the Starbucks union movement come out of people with backgrounds in the CPUSA, DSA, some various other Marxist and anarchist sectarian groups, the IWW, and they play a role in those unions, and a vital one. But once the unions exist and are codified in the U.S., they become immediately unpopular. For reasons that I don't think are dealt with. One thing I do think is interesting that Lynch speaks to, though, is where labor really has gone. I was going to talk to you guys about this because I literally saw an ad a couple weeks ago on Twitter for UK labor running off of the Floyd protest in the United States, only mentioning the US context as if it was British context and that their reform laws would address the issues that were. And I'm like, but
I guess it must have been served to you because you were in America. You were in America, right? So it must be appealing to foreign Britons in America or something.
There is an attempt, though. There is definitely, whether conscious or unconscious, and obviously for some people it is a conscious attempt, and for others it's just due to their media diet. There is this importation of American politics and American culture wars into Britain, where you do see, for example, on the conservative right, the same kind of weird cultural Marxism talking points being forwarded. And also on the left, Black Lives Matter and George Floyd acting as a spark for popular protest. So I think there is to borrow a phrase, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. I think there is a gradual sort of spread out of American politics to the world and becoming a kind of driving force, or at least a powerful force in shaping discourse in those countries.
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the things about the United States and Europe is, for all the complaints about our negative influence in Europe, and as far as I feel about the dangly bits off of Asia, they can pry as much as they want. We learned it from you anyway. So people were like, "Oh, Varn really hates Europeans," and they would be correct. But you can't build a program off of hating Europeans as much as I would like to. The thing that I see with the left in the English-speaking part of the European world, and I guess there is no English-speaking part of the European world after Brexit, but whatever.
Ireland is still...
Yeah, okay, Ireland. Is that our rhetoric, our way of speaking about this has directly influenced the way a lot of professional activists talk. And it's ours. It's specifically the U.S. form of it and our context. And while I normally roll my eyes at claims of left colonialism in Europe, because again, who cares? It's Europe. That limitation tells me that labor sees its appeal in stuff like you said, British expatriates, a certain class of people who are mostly graduate degree holders, around the world. And it does represent an Americanization of British politics, an Americanization that was also true under the Corbyn leadership of labor, because that's when labor's demographic base actually started to look an awfully lot like the patterns that you see with the Democrats in the United States, meaning that any historical exceptionality of labor coming out of an actual labor party and with an actual labor base has been undone even under the Corbyn period. And that's something that I used to point out, and leftists in the UK got really angry with me. But then I was like, but you need to address this. It's not to say that there aren't working class people in the Corbyn labor back when it was a thing. There definitely was, but they were urban. It didn't really do anything about all the hollowed out northern boroughs and any of that.
There's also a couple of points I'd bring in here, and perhaps Stefan could also spread some light on this. Yeah, I think when we look, I think you're right to a certain degree. And Steve Paxton actually wrote an article on this in Sublation magazine, and I don't agree with everything in the article, but the point he makes is that when we talk about working class in Britain, there's obviously this very strong cultural component that working class is like working down a mine or doing some heavy industry job. And in Britain, the working class is increasingly diverse. There is a regional difference. There is an ethnic difference. And there isn't that kind of cultural unity that exists in earlier periods. So it's less that labor, yes, labor is driven by the same kind of tendencies that affect the Democratic Party, but a lot of the support, like inverted commas, working class Tory support, and there is working class Tory support, but a lot of it is actually small business people, petty bourgeois people who are culturally closer to the northern working class, but who are small business owners and who are being squeezed by, the international markets and things like that. The white vine man, as they say. So I think what's happened in Britain is there's been a massive cultural fragmentation of the working class, and the political alliances that have been formed have, to a certain degree, taken place on educational levels, which are not great ways to work out people's social class anymore, or at least less useful than they used to be. And the tendency, I think, to a certain degree, under Corbyn, was to arrest, to seeping away of working class support from the Labour Party, which has been happening like crazy since Tony Blair. And I think Corbyn stopped and to a certain degree reversed that. But one of the paradoxes of the Corbyn era is that it also opened the door for this kind of greater cultural camp, which in terms of the electoral geography of Britain, not in terms of absolute percentages and numbers, Corbyn's numbers in absolute percentage terms of the vote were pretty good historically for the Labour Party. But it allowed a kind of cultural war that favored the Conservatives that led to the loss of certain, inverted commas, Labour safe seats in the north of England. So I think
the interesting thing with Corbyn, and I think in the US it's already the case that the Democrats will always win young people, right? But what happened with Corbyn, less than kind of a change in class dynamics or a change in anything else, was that before the Labour Party would win maybe 35% of young people, and with Corbyn they would win 70 to 80%. That was the big massive change. Of before, there wasn't that much kind of age differential between how groups voted in the UK. And even if you go back to 1983, it was young people voted for Thatcher, while older people voted for the Labour Party. So that was the big massive change, that Corbyn was enormously popular among young people. And so obviously that led, because, young people have a lot of degree holders. Young people are more likely to have kind of like this progressive affect. They're more likely to care about fucking what happens in America with black people or whatever. And so this was a big change. And obviously young people are also less likely to have this cultural affect of being part of the working class.
They're also less likely to actually vote.
Oh yeah, obviously. That means that's why he didn't win. But the point is, like, for instance, I'm one generation away from coal miners, from shipbuilders and so on, but you really couldn't fucking tell, could you?
No.
And so there's been a massive change in Britain, and it's kind of a change that happened so rapidly that the old kind of working class are still there and still voting and still controlling elections, while young people who are also, they're obviously the poorest demographic, if you go on age. I don't know if you guys know in Britain, but like right now, British workers obviously have to go and like fight an incredible battle to get a pay rise, which will be above inflation. But there's this thing called the triple lock, which basically ensures that pensions always increase over inflation year on year. And so old people will automatically get an inflation-busting 12% increase in their pension next year, which obviously good for them, but it shows kind of where the Tories are at, where for them doing something like this, if they didn't do it, it would be suicidal. But they're not going to give the same to people, non-retirees. But obviously this is a strategy of like Thanatos, you know? This is, you can't just rely on these older and older demographics, and at some point something will change. But obviously we shouldn't be like the Democrats and believe that, you know, we're going to vote 80% for Labour Party when in 30 years, but some change is going to happen. It might be positive, it might be negative.
I mean, well, the hard thing for me is everything I read indicates that because of the electoral geography of England, that basically Labour will be a permanent opposition party for quite some time. So it's hard to say. I mean, historically, that has been the case. I think the more interesting thing that we have to ask ourselves is you know, as far as the British left, is where the fuck are they? Well,
it's, I mean, the British left is super demoralized. I mean,
right.
That's what happened. There was a big defeat with Corbynism, and after that defeat, there's a lot of like internally looking around.
So what I find interesting is that in the United States left, Britain used to be where everybody in the U.S. looked for everything, because we think our European brethren are somehow smarter than us, for reasons that I don't quite understand. But I would say that influence is over. Like, for example, the influence of, say, British Trotskyism on the United States was actually huge, because of the ISO, even though it wasn't still formally aligned with the SWP in the UK and had some kind of weird split in the aughts, it still got all of its running notes basically from the UK SWP, even after the SWP blew up, as most Trotskyist sects do, in some weird sexual assault scandal. Which seems to be a current thing that always happens. It's like an eternal return in Trotskyist groups. But regardless, it's now become to the point where it's like I don't really hear the same voice, like you know, where I hear British voices talking to the American left, sublation, because no one else cares, and that's where we are.
That old generation is dying off. That's the thing. Like,
right.
that form of left has diluted, and the dominant form is like, really, if you want to be honest about it, it's fucking pod and Twitter leftism. That's what's replaced the old
in the
sectarian
UK
left
as well.
I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, if you look at the numbers, people in the UK watch the Hassan Piker fellow. People in the UK watch YT. People know those people. People know Anna Kasparian is. I know working class dudes, and it's the same is true on the right. Like, I have a friend who totally lost it and was like took full QAnon, and was saying that Tom Hanks was making shoes out of like 5-year-old skin. You know, like, so I think that there's a kind of it's kind of
interestingly, I will say this: the right in North America, like, all our best reactionaries are fucking from Canada. Canada just like imports them and oil. That's what they do, and it's interesting because there is like cross-national right-wing coordination in a real sense between, say, the Conservative Party in Canada, the Tories, and to some degree the GOP. But it's only at an intellectual level, you know. That's whereas, and so yeah, there's all these like like discourse streams and stuff that someone can get into. The left has a media stream, but if I'm now thinking that, okay, everyone in Britain's listening to TYT, that makes me despair. Like, because you're not going to get it's hard to get a good understanding of American politics on a fine grain level from left media. Actually, it has very specific talking points that are around very specific cities. It's
Well, you can watch This Is Revolution or Van Vlog and get very, very good
fair enough
information.
You could sell us, but there is a sense in which there's a reason why sublation is in New York today, and that's where that's left media is, and it would let you think that most of the United States was somehow the greater five boroughs, and it absolutely is not.
Well, the reason I have to jump in here, the reason we're in New York was because Jason knew a dude who would give us a venue for free.
Okay, cool. But you're also in New York because you would also have an audience there.
Hey, look, if it was going to happen in Springfield, I would be totally down with that.
Should we move on from talking about America to talking about America?
Yeah.
Let's talk about this. Okay, lads, check this out. There you go, guys.
I thought you were going to play the tear gas clip.
Oh, dude, did you send me a tear gas clip? What did you send me a tear gas clip?
I didn't send anything to you. I just thought that I assumed you were going to show something interesting.
I did see a tear gas clip. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what's going on, guess what? Roe v. Wade has been overturned by the Supreme Court of the United States, undoing a significant amount of time, nearly 50 years of legal precedent, and ending or not ending abortion in the United States. People who are not in the United States, Roe v. Wade does not end abortion in the United States, but it does allow states within the United States to now make abortion illegal. And of course, there are questions about how far they can make it illegal. They can make it illegal in their state. Are they going to be able to prosecute people who go to get abortions in other states or to go overseas? We don't know what that's going to do, but this is an important legal decision. To a certain degree, it already confirms existing trends we've seen, over the last couple of decades, more and more aggressive attempts to limit abortion in many American states. In my home state of Missouri, for example, I think the only abortion clinic, the last abortion clinic, is in St. Louis. So, effectively in many places, there isn't access to abortion anyway. But this is an important legal precedent because now we're in a kind of new territory. And I should note, Roe v. Wade was, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, Roe v. Wade was not specifically about abortion per se, even though it was about abortion, but it's about privacy.
Roe v. Wade grants an implied right to privacy off of due process, which I don't think people quite grasp. How weak that, and I know I'm going to sound like I'm a conservative here, but that was a weak legal argument. It really was. It was an implied right off of an implied right off of due process. So it's two labels of implication removed. The reason why is that the other argument, which was granting bodily autonomy and basing it off of bodily autonomy as opposed to privacy, would have made a lot of stuff in the United States illegal in other ways. So it was...
Yeah, you can't have a right to bodily autonomy because we need to fucking arrest you bitch.
Right, exactly. And like, we have a death penalty, et cetera, so you can't make that argument. And unfortunately, however, people don't realize how much of progressive jurisprudence is based off that implied right to privacy. So it's been actually gutted in two ways, not just in this Roe v. Wade case, but also in cases around the Fifth Amendment, which basically doesn't exist anymore. So now states can can do pretty much what they want to, and to private individuals as far as like invading their privacy. And there's very little recourse now for suing the government when they do it, even if they're wrongfully convicted. In fact, the Supreme Court also this week decided that the government does not have to present exculpating evidence or exculpating medical treatment or whatever in legal cases, even when it would for sure reverse a conviction and prove innocence. So this is where the court is. So with Roe v. Wade falling, all the rights on, so many people have heard about Obergefell, Texas, these cases that decriminalize homosexuality, enable gay marriage, they actually are also based on two legal precedents, but one of them just got gutted. So
interracial marriage too, right? Though Thomas,
interracial marriage, even though Thomas didn't mention it. Alito didn't mention Obergefell. Alito has explicitly in his concurrence, if you read it very closely, indicates that while they're not willing to go after Brown versus Board of Education or Loving versus Virginia, which are also complicated, and I've noticed that Thomas didn't mention Loving in his list of things he wants to attack, but we have seen, for example, there is now going to be a legal challenge that's going to make Loving versus Virginia up for a vote. And for people who don't know what that means that interracial marriage can be made illegal, gay marriage can be made illegal, gay sex can be recriminalized.
Let's just hold on here for a second, though. So yeah, of all of these are legitimately, open questions in terms of whether these things are constitutionally protected. But in terms of things that conservatives actually want to go after, gay marriage seems plausible, right? It seems plausible that they might try and overturn gay marriage in some parts, in some states.
Brown versus Board is also plausible.
So segregation?
Right. They won't do it. The ability to have segregated schools and to get rid of things like the Supreme Court's actually already gutted this law, but for example, elements of the Civil Rights Act, which enforce actually monitoring how state public schools treat racial minorities, but only in former Confederate states. It doesn't actually do it, which is why New York has the most segregated school system in the country, because it's exempted from Civil Rights Act provisions. But they're also opening up for reversing that entirely, so that there would be no basically no promise on
the Civil Rights Act
funding
is one of the things it has a place in redistricting, right?
There's something called pre-clearance. It's called pre-clearance, where you
have to get pre-clearance for if you're going to hurt racial communities, and again, only in certain states. But
wait. Let's roll back. But for all these things, it's opened up a can of worms.
Yeah,
but guys, what is the solution? Is it vote Democrat harder? Do we need to vote Democrat harder?
We fucking voted Democrats in this time, and
did you vote Democrat?
No, but
then you and Susan Sarandon are responsible for this.
Fine. Actually, I voted a lot of things. I think I did vote for a couple of Democrats because it was the only thing available. But yeah, people talk about packing the courts that require 60 votes in the Senate. However, the issue that you have is Obama's known this was a threat since 2007 and said he actually said he was going to codify abortion rights into legislative law. He deprioritized that in 2009 and never did it. They also decided to maintain the filibuster, which, despite people thinking it's constitutional, is a very specific House ruling that was made in the aughts something that you could now do procedurally, which for people who don't know, the filibuster in the before the 90s, you actually had to get up there and fucking talk until the vote was. So like it was actually, there's a cost to filibustering, which there no longer is.
Which is also really boring. It's really fun when you have stuff where like parliamentary has to stand up for like 12 hours and he's pissing himself.
Yep. But I was listening to last night. I was coming back from seeing a friend of mine, and I had the unfortunate benefit of hearing the BBC because, again, American liberals have some weird fetish for Europe. So, like, whenever they run out of the NPR, they'll throw the BBC on. And they had Gloria Steinem come on, which I, to be honest, forgot she was even still alive. And she explicitly started shaming voters for not voting for Hillary Clinton immediately on British broadcasting, as if I was just sort of amazed at this.
Yeah, it's fucked up that everyone in the world gets a vote in the presidential elections, but the Democrats still can't win.
It's like one of the I'm not gonna name them, but one of the most opportunistic DSA aligned academics of Persian extraction who just goes where the wind is blowing and gets on all the panels for everything. And also, I'm told, I don't have direct experience of this, like consistently lies about his relationship to all kinds of movements in Iran and things like that in order to give himself authenticity. So with that information, everybody, you're going to have to go on Twitter and find out who that is. But this person, one of the first things they do, because obviously where is the wind blowing, is like, well, people said not voting for Hillary Clinton was like didn't matter, and it didn't matter, but look, this is a direct result. And all I can say is, well, fuck you, because like most people did vote for Hillary Clinton. Most of the people you're trying to shame probably voted for Hillary Clinton, whether they liked it or not. And where did it all get us, everybody, guys? Like, this is not a problem of
yeah.
I mean, the Democrats, let me just put this out here. It's like, this is exactly what I was saying about the cognizant dissonance between like saying that the Republicans are fascist and bipartisanship. We are being driven by Democratic Party fundraisers to get milked over abortion at the same time as the Democratic Party continues to support a pro-life governor in Louisiana, campaigns in Texas for a pro-life Democrat. It's bloody a make or break issue, or it's not. And if they continue to do this, how can one take them seriously? Right.
Tom Kane voted for Amy Coney Barrett. That's all I got to say. Like that's Hillary's VP.
All these jokers, right? They can't even be good partisans, right? If the Democrats, for example, actually, whether I agree with them or not, functionally provided some kind of break on, like the right-wing shift of the judiciary in a meaningful way, you might be able to make the case for them. But it's increasingly hard to make the case of even tactically voting for the Democrats when so much energy gets sucked up into voting for Democrats that there's no energy left up. And I believe this is a zero-sum question. I believe that like all the juice you're putting into electing Democrats, that is juice that is not going somewhere else more politically. And I can be persuaded that like trying to elect somebody sometimes matters. Like, I'm fine with having good, people in Congress. I'm not emotional about like, I can't vote for a Democrat. I hate Democrats. Democrats is a voting line. But with the leadership there is at this moment, it's very fucking hard to make that case that, might as well just let the Republicans do it.
Embassies don't have to obey state law, right? Like on embassy land, it doesn't apply to them, does it?
No, embassy reservations and a few other things would only be subject to federal law because the reservations are technically sovereign internal. No, they're sovereign nations, kind of, but not really.
Not really.
And I mean, the objective should be like people who care about the right for abortion. the objective should not be to elect Democrats in the hope that they will like maybe pack the court, or maybe in 40 years they will have managed to hold power enough to like have a progressive majority on the court. The energy, if you care about it, is to help people on the ground with abortion funds, and B, in political terms, organizing referendums in those states where there is a referendum process to constitutionalize or legalize abortion.
Yeah, the problem that you're going to have with that is like we had progressive referendums here in Utah. All right, we passed a bunch of stuff. We passed legalized marijuana. We passed taking more healthcare benefits from the federal government, not letting them count Mormon charity as part of their meeting the standards need to be spent for, which is a very small thing. But for people who don't know, when you have matching federal funds, the states are supposed to do so much around that. One of the neoliberal things that Mormons pioneered under Reagan, and it was specifically Mormons, not just Utahns, was that the Utah state could count church charity as part of its meeting of obligations of spending out of its own money to meet when it takes federal money, which is absurd. I mean, it's like you think about it, it seems like a violation of the First Amendment. The other thing the court is doing is totally gutting the First Amendment.
Boycotts don't count.
yeah. So boycotts are not protected speech, but I can religiously. But states can be mandated to give religious institutions that proselytize money now, according to the Supreme Court. This has been a disaster. It's been a disaster for 2 years. Unfortunately, Roe v. Wade is what gets people watching. And why I made why I do want to emphasize some of what the liberals are saying. The precedent that this thing undoes has massive implications, particularly when you pair it with other rulings that this court has done in the last month. But Democrats don't really care. And we know they don't really care because this opinion got leaked 2 months ago almost. And they had their mailers ready for the day it would get reversed. They had fundraising calls ready for the day it would get reversed. But they had nothing. They did nothing for the day it got reversed beyond that. Now, yes, they tried to pass it. Mm-hmm.
That the leak might have actually had the effect of like tamping down an outrage. Because if you told me like 4 months ago that Roe v. Wade was going to get overturned, I would be like, what the fuck? But then the thing got leaked 2 months ago. So on the day it happened yesterday, I was like, oh yeah, this is the thing that people said was going to happen.
I mean, and that feeds into the idea it was leaked by a conservative, not a liberal.
Which it actually did seem to force John Roberts to back the conservative wing of the court more than he felt comfortable doing, actually. So it did have the opposite effect than what liberals thought it would. It didn't put pressure on John Roberts to come up with a better compromise, even though he's publicly stated that he would have preferred that. He still felt like now he had to back the conservative end of the court up because of the leak. All this is to say, the other thing that might happen, and I want people to understand this, is the Democrats are not lying that the conservatives will try to pass an abortion ban. Will it go through? I am skeptical because even with the high end of their projected wins, the conservative faction of the Republicans needs people like Susan Collins to vote with them, and I doubt that'll happen. All of that is said, though, things are real bad, and the Democrats are trying to make an argument for voting harder under the circumstances, and some conservatives seem to be actually afraid that this might work, actually. I mean, even Trump has been really ambivalent on this ruling. I mean, from the Trump geopolitical perspective, this is something that's good to motivate your base, but you don't actually want to deliver on it.
Yeah, I mean that's always been the argument.
To the degree that Trump even has personal political opinions anymore, I don't think he gives a shit about abortion.
No. And that's always been the argument from liberals, that the conservatives don't really mean it because this is a perfect electoral mission for them. And the reality is that it just came to a point where it was no longer sustainable. And this is something important, I think, that if leftists are to pursue an electoral strategy through the Democratic Party, I'm afraid voting blue, no matter who, is not an effective way to do that, because
if you're always going to, man,
if you're because basically you don't have any leverage.
Yeah, you're captured. Your game theoretically captured in a left coalition unless you are willing to cost purple seats to get leverage, and no progressive is willing to do that. And also, as far as left media goes, if we only let people like Jimmy Dore critique the Squad or whatever, then we're left with Jimmy Dore being the primary people critiquing the Squad. We have to be completely honest and say it's not just the DNC or the DCC that failed. It was everyone in this coalition who seemed to think that being cynical about this stuff would pay off, because the Republicans didn't mean it. Well, one of the things that you and I have gone back about privately, Gene, is we've talked about this, and I was going back and forth because I was like, well, evangelicals are a tiny group. It's funny because I'm hearing the BBC talk about the rise of the American religious right, and I'm like, that happened 30 fucking years ago. In fact, actually, that's over. The religious right's actually dying in demographic terms very quickly. But now, if you want their loyalty and they can make up marginal gains, you can actually give them some of the shit you've been taunting them with for decades, which seems to have been the play. And I want to point out that it was also the undemocratic parts of the American government, even from the pathetic democracy standards of the U.S., that did this because it shields people. But you will have a move for a federal abortion ban, and because I think people need to look at this strategically in the United States too. In red areas like Salt Lake, we have two Republican parties, right? In Utah, and the moderates actually consistently win. In areas that are purple, like Texas, Georgia, Florida, the marginal base makes the difference in a very tight race, and even though they're demographically doomed, their voters care and will come out. And so what you see here is in contested states is actually where the most conservative government pushes are coming from. And so
it's the old frontier thesis, isn't it? It's like when you have like the hardcore nationalists don't come from the pure heartland; they come from the frontiers where they have to assert and fight their battles. Right.
Well, you see this in the Jan 6 people too. Like if you look at the Jan 6 where they came from, they all come from like blue or purple states, and they're like right out. They're like in the suburbs, right outside of New York, are right outside of Chevy Chase, Virginia. For people who don't know, that's basic greater DC. It's a Democrat stronghold. In these sort of places, that's where they're coming from. That's like the craziest radicals I meet are from fucking California, like right-wing radicals, like always. But what I was saying is they're also willing to, like, if people took reforming the Democratic Party and make it a Labor Party seriously, and for whatever you think of the validation of that or not, or like if it's a valid thesis, which I'm skeptical, but you would not be progressive, loyal, brew no matter who. You would actually be fucking the Democrats up in certain key purple districts to make them give you concessions so you don't do it more, which is exactly what the national conservative base under Trump really does. They will lose a local election to gain more power in the party to win in the long term, and it's worked for them.
I agree. And it's like
we don't see that here.
Yeah, exactly. I don't, like, my personal opinion is I don't foreclose the possibility of doing some kind of electoral politics through the Democratic Party, but you have to play hardball because the Democratic Party is amorphous. And if you are not willing to metaphorically dump a Democrat over the side, then why even bother? Because you're not gonna convince people by nice words and persuasion. You're only going to convince them when their material interests are threatened. For example, there's no excuse. No Democrat no progressive or leftist should be in Arizona giving Kirsten Sinema a vote, right? Or Joe Manchin a vote just because, well, they make things worse, right? Having a weak Democratic Party, even if, for example, you can make the case that it takes the edge off some of the harsher policies that Republicans could offer. It's really like an anesthetic. It's because you mask the problem for a short period of time, but when the problem does come back, it's worse and it's less sustainable. And this strategy, so for people who do believe in playing the electoral strategy, do that, but play the big boys. The liberals will not vote for you, right? The liberals will sell you out in a general election. Look what happened to that woman in Buffalo. She won the Democratic primary fair and square, and then the former mayor came back and screwed her over and won with Republican support. So if you want to play electoral politics, you have to play a bloody game, and you have to be willing to tank Democrats and hit them where it hurts until they are forced to extract concessions. Now, of course, there's other ways to extract concessions through labor organizing and things like that. But if we're talking electoral politics,
redacted,
if you're talking electoral politics, and you're talking trying to extract concessions from a party that runs for election, you have to be willing to sabotage that party in order to force it to at least move in your direction and give you something. Because if they know they can count on you, they will give you nothing.
I mean, there's a lot of people.
You know, I brought up embassies.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about Cuba doing abortions on embassy.
That would be so based. That would be so based.
First, I was thinking that Cuba could offer. I don't know if people know, but Cuba offers free medical attention, free medical training to American citizens.
Yep. You can't use it in America, but it's pretty useful to have.
Yeah, and I was thinking about them offering abortions in Cuba, but obviously getting to Cuba is very hard for Americans, so it'd be a bit useless. But then I was like, they could just do it on fucking embassy grounds, but they don't have any consulates in states which are banning abortion, so it's irrelevant anyway. And obviously it's not going to happen, but it's a fun idea.
Isn't it hard to go to Cuba? It's hard. You can't really go to Cuba easily from the United States, but you can from Mexico. But I didn't tell you that.
Yeah,
don't be encouraging TIA. But guys, we've been going on for 2.5 hours. I'm sure everybody is sick of listening to us blather on about stuff. Chat, are you sick of listening to us? Come on, say yes, because
it's late. It's late in.
Well, it's not late. It's 7:30. Dinner's on the table, and I hopefully, if all goes well,
we've actually got more viewers now than we did an hour ago. I just checked.
I know, that's crazy, but I will be back in the United States next week, hopefully, if all goes well, and saying farewell to this wonderful 6 months I've spent in the United Kingdom, and I'm going to miss England. Even though it's Turf Island or whatever you call it, Vaughn.
I mean, it was a pathetic display from the two of us that you've been here more than 6 months. We failed to meet up. But
that's because we tried because, and you had COVID. My whole family had COVID, and you wanted to protect your grandma, which is totally legit.
Yeah, it was COVID twice.
Yep, the COVID-geddon, man. So much COVID. Yep, I was going to go to Wales. My dad got long COVID. And I got COVID when Stefan was supposed to come over, and he probably would have risked it, but he had to go back to his grandma's house, and he didn't want to give his grandma COVID. So it's been pretty
perfect sense.
I would not be.
But hopefully I'll be back in Britain at some time in the near future. It's been beautiful. Van, what's going on at Van Vlog?
We have stuff coming out on quantitative easing and inflation. We have stuff coming out on the history of Henrik Grossman. We have stuff coming out on union organizing in the schools and the Southern unions. We have stuff coming out. I have all kinds of stuff coming out. I got something with Left Reckoning coming out. Some crossover.
I heard about that.
Yeah, which I want to thank TIR people, because that's why that happens. Normally, social democrats don't like to talk to me. So, I mean, for reasons that I don't quite understand. I don't know why social democrats might have.
It's because you're so grumpy. It's because you're a grumpy badger.
It's maybe that I've like called for things in certain time periods that maybe like, I don't know, that social democrats should maybe be kneecapped or something. But I'm trying to repair that. No one should kneecap a social democrat in their life. They should just try to talk to them into not being so loyal to the Democrats that they're basically useless. But yeah,
the tactic is just not to really let on what your actual politics are.
Yeah, exactly.
I doubt Chad has any idea what I really think about anything.
Which actually, I mean, and I will say this: in most municipal areas, if you wanted to like take a school board or whatever, in a lot of them, you don't have to declare a party. You just don't. Like you don't have to. So don't. Like,
Stefan. What's going on in the Stefan universe? I believe you'll be hosting some things in the near future.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to do the magazine show on Monday, where presumably we'll go through all the sublation things that we've done on abortion.
Sounds good. Sounds gloomy.
I've submitted my 3rd article to Sublation magazine. I'm currently writing the 4th one.
Is Alfie checking it for you?
I don't know. I sent it in. I haven't heard anything.
I haven't received it.
I sent it to the Slack.
Oh, I'm gonna have a look then. I'm gonna look in the Slack. What you can do in the Slack is tag me in the Slack, and I will.
Yeah, but I didn't send it. I did it through the email thing.
Okay, I'm gonna have to go in there and find it. Which channel did you put it on? At least
I don't know. I did it in the email thingy. I sent it to that email address. I said whatever, the same exact thing I did last time.
Oh, fair enough. We can sort this out off air.
That's what this is what happens when you go through the correct channels on air.
On air, exactly. Go through the correct channels. Okay, guys. So it has been beautiful. Jason will be back with Pascal, hopefully, on Tuesday. I believe they're doing something on Afro-pessimism, so that should be wonderful. And
Afro-pessimism, French optimism.
French optimism and Afro-pessimism. And with that, we are out.